are standing by. Thank you. There will probably be people filtering in as you do that. Hi, I copy, yes? Okay, I'm going, guys. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator, Sam Barend, SVP North America, Public-Private Partnerships, AECOM Capital.
It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. Thank you so much for joining this panel. This panel, as you've seen by the description, is to talk about public-private partnerships, private financing, and infrastructure, and what it means for smart cities. Now, when we think about these smart cities and what it's really going to take to move forward, what we're here today to discuss is how government officials, business leaders, taxpayers can all come together and work together to put forward these public-private partnerships, because we believe that without these public-private partnerships, there will be no smart cities, that these are really the fundamental ingredient to moving forward the smart cities. And from whether we're developing mass transit, whether we're rebuilding our schools, our courthouses, or our energy systems or water, that bringing the private sector together with our public sector is going to be critical. So with that said, I'm going to introduce our all-star panel that we have lined up for you today. We bring perspectives from Europe, from Canada, from the US. We bring the fund perspective, the legal perspective, and me. I hail from AECOM. We're a global engineering construction firm. So I bring the delivery perspective. So I'm going to introduce my colleagues on the panel. First, Thomas Barrett. He's Director and Chief Representative of the European Investment Bank. Kent Rowey, who is a partner with Allen and Overy. Graeme Conway, who is a Senior Managing Director with Macquarie Infrastructure and Real Assets. And Bruce Hogg, who is the Managing Director and Head of Infrastructure for the Americas for the Canadian Pension Plan. So now, before we really launch into talking about smart cities and the implication of public-private partnerships, it seems that the term public-private partnerships is thrown around, and many of you can infer different definitions from it. So I think it may be helpful for all of you here today, and purposes of this conversation, for us just to frame what public-private partnerships really mean and what we're talking about. Because today we're talking about infrastructure delivery, so how do you all, if you could just go through and share with the group how you view public-private partnerships and what that means.
Thank you very much. I think the European experience would actually lead us to take a very generous and open-minded definition of public-private partnerships. I think when we look in the context of infrastructure investment, we really see many strategic, occasionally long-term areas where there has to be a combination of the resources, the skills, the risk-taking capabilities, and the capital of both public and private. And we look at arrangements which bring those two together, however strictly or widely defined as public-private partnerships. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Fantastic to be here. I'm a deal lawyer, and so when I think of public-private partnerships, I think of it in terms of a contract. It's a deal between a government agency and a private sector participant to build, own, operate, finance an infrastructure asset. It's a technique in a sense. It's a way for the private sector to put capital to work, to accelerate project development for deals that are suitable for private sector investment. And I think most importantly, it's a means for the public sector to allocate the risks of performance and financing of an infrastructure asset and thereby relieve the government agency of the long-term whole life costs of building, operating, and maintaining it. I think I'd also say that usually when you think of P3s, you think of big, massive bridges and toll roads, and certainly that is a big part of the P3 market here in the US and abroad. But I think in a municipal context, there's a lot of public-private partnership opportunities that aren't big roads, smaller types of assets or tech assets, things like street lighting, things like fiber, telecommunication systems for subways, the sort of things that are very suitable to transfer risk and to get financing via contractual mechanism, but it's not at the front of everybody's mind when they think of P3.
Great. Thanks, Ken. Right. Ken, as a lawyer, mentioned P3s from a contractual point of view. I think from an investment point of view, we invest money in infrastructure. I'd look at the definition of P3s and go to the risk transfer. How much risk is getting transferred from the public sector to the private sector? And that can cover the full spectrum from a little bit of risk all the way to the entire risk of the project. So the partnership between the public and the private is on that risk transfer. The public sector could transfer an operating agreement or a maintenance agreement just to clean a building to the private sector, all the way to the other end of the spectrum where you could transfer the design, the build, the operations and the maintenance to the private sector. And indeed, at the complete end of the spectrum of that partnership is privatisation. In a privatisation right at the end of P3s, it's where the public sector gives to the private sector all of the risk and all the reward of a particular infrastructure project. And I think as this panel evolves over the next 35 minutes, there'll be areas where that risk transfer for various projects will vary from the small end right to the complete end of risk transfer.
Thank you. And like Graeme, our job is to actually invest in these public-private partnerships. But if we sort of take a step back, we do think about the public policy context for them. I think, as Kent and others talked about, ultimately people do think on the funding side in terms of private sector bringing incremental capital. But I think what ultimately drives these from a policy point of view is, as discussed, is the risk transfer. But ultimately there's areas where you can bring innovation and or commercialization. So the question is, relative to what we done in a traditional delivery model, is there a way to leverage private sector innovation, expertise, risk management, the like? And that goes from project selection in terms of helping governments identify what the right project is to deliver, like what's the most efficient way to deliver the infrastructure, the actual delivery, excuse me, in terms of what's the best design and what's the least cost way or the most effective way to deliver the service. And again, there's obviously the benefits of private sector construction. Ken talked about whole of life costs. What's the best way to optimize and deliver the highest quality service at the lowest cost over the life of a project, which is something often the private sector is able to do because they can think beyond individual budgeting purposes. And increasingly, one thing, and I'll talk about some examples, what's been helpful with the, the private sector is they've been able to think it through commercialization and or innovation that might not normally be thought about in the context of a traditional delivery. An obvious one people will see increasingly, which is airports used to be designed effectively, that's the way you got dropped off in a taxi or a bus or by a loved one. You then walked down a hallway and got on a plane. Increasingly what people have thought about, well, you're now going to spend a few hours there. What are the services that people actually want to do when they're there? How can you make sure people have connectivity? And what are the commercialization things that can happen in terms of delivering what people want? And in some cases, people are focused on the base service, don't think about, well, what are we actually trying to achieve, and are there other things that can be added to it? So I would point to there's a degree of benefits that the private sector can bring that get expressed through a public-private partnership. And we'll talk about today, it's a function of what's the best fit given a specific situation.
So just to sum up, because we live and breathe this every day, so it's like second nature to us, but the whole concept of risk transfer may not be intuitive to you all. What this means for cities, and what all the folks on the panel have noted, that this whole concept of risk transfer means that cities can get projects delivered on time, on budget, and with performance guarantees. What each of them have noted is that the private sector is taking the risk of delivering on time, on budget, and in accordance with performance over the long term. So essentially, these tricky, sticky, complex projects that cities are looking to advance, all of the smart cities concepts generally are big, bold ideas that require, to get them done, we want to see them in our lifetime, and everything that the panel is talking about, having that sort of certainty is the way to achieve this dream. So with that said, and with this context in mind, what I think you're all here today to learn about is what does this mean for smart cities, and where have we seen public-private partnerships really work? How have they delivered the vision of smart cities? And we've seen it already in Europe and in Canada. We've seen tremendous examples of cities being transformed very quickly through public-private partnerships. Tom, Europe is a leader in public-private partnerships for many decades. When you look around at examples, you can look to all the nations within Europe as front runners. Can you provide some anecdotes for folks here today in terms of how public-private partnerships have worked, and some significant projects in major urban areas that have stood out?
Thank you. I think to tell this narrative in a fairly simple way, one really has to say that it has been a fairly significant learning experience for cities, and indeed for government in general, as they have sought to use both private resources as well as public resources to meet public policy objectives. So in essence, the start is about the public policy objective. What is the longer-term vision, both for cities themselves in general, for specific cities, and indeed how does this fit into a broader government program of actually sustaining investment in key public sector areas? Now, those topics are not separate. So what we're talking about in essence is there has to be a competent public sector partner right from the beginning, and that there has to be a competence not only in spending public money, but actually in making decisions to interface with the private sector and to ensure that various common objectives can be met over generations or indeed multiples of generations. To make this simple, if you want to look at the key areas of infrastructure, whether they're education, whether they are health, primary healthcare or tertiary healthcare in local communities, if you want to look at urban infrastructure, whether it is metro systems, tramways, urban systems, water, environment, waste, all of these things have been done at scale in Europe over a period of time. Broadly speaking, if we look at the results and if we look at the impact, the European experience has been quite satisfactory. Like every place else, there are bad apples in the barrel, projects that have gone sour and which have attracted undoubted and justified media comment. But the broad experience has been very positive. Therefore, we have developed financing tools that are actually appropriate to handling the issues that our other panelists here have spoken about, which is the attribution of risk between the public and private sector, and most importantly, the attribution of reward, and finally, the ability to terminate in the event that one or other party is not in fact fulfilling its obligations. All of these things are essential to citizens who are actually looking for public services. And really what the European experience has been about, in different ways in different countries, has been in making sure that that model works.
Are there any specific projects that you would point to that would provide some color for the group?
one doesn't talk simply about one project, because the very notion of public-private partnerships is as a tool to handle generalized public infrastructure. So if one can talk about, for example, urban transport systems, whether they're tube lines, metros, tramways, whatever, this is one example where I think the European experience has been uniformly satisfactory. If we look at water, waste, we have different models, whether they're a utility model, a concession model, whether they are limited recourse projects. We have found different ways of handling particular circumstances in different countries. But broadly speaking, the sectoral experience across a number of the main infrastructure sectors have been broadly positive.
Now, Bruce, Canada has also been a leader in public-private partnerships, delivering over $120 billion worth of P3 projects in the past 15 years. Your fund has been involved in a significant amount of projects there and globally. Can you provide some insight as well on why Canada has been so successful, what the rest of the world can learn and other cities can learn in terms of really implementing some best practices, and also from your experience in major cities like Vancouver or Toronto, how they have utilized P3s?
Yeah, I think, and I was involved in some of the very early projects in Vancouver and around the world, actually in a previous job, a previous life. And what I would say, having sort of seen the evolution over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, what was ultimately the driver for some of these things was so pick public transit. Huge social good. A lot of people have thought this is something that should get done. Invariably, and looking at Vancouver, they had a number of projects that had literally been on the books for 10 or 15 years. So when I showed up, there was a stack of papers that was about that high from the floor, which was all the previous studies, feasibility, concepts. And what was being faced increasingly was, just given limitations in the public purse, that there is money, healthcare, obviously a very key consideration in all countries. When you sort of thought about the constraints of the public purse, conventional delivery models, there was a question about, first of all, the capabilities to deliver them in a foreseeable future, then the ability to fund and operate them within a constrained budget. And the difference ultimately came down to is building it now versus something potentially being on the books for another 10 years and being built in 15 years. And so what happened in Vancouver and other cities to start with is, and this was the Canada Line, which is a airport to downtown rail link and also going out to Richmond, was what's the best way to do this? And what happened was you then got the various levels of government convening around a public-private partnership to then work with the private sector to figure out what's the best alignment, how can this get built, because it involves a huge amount of tunneling, and in a way that will ultimately deliver the required service on time, on budget, and deliver it, and this was in anticipation of the 2010 Olympics, and it was done. And so when that type of project gets delivered, that then led to the Evergreen Line in Vancouver as well. Toronto is now doing a $6 billion crosstown LRT project, which will be done with private sector expertise around design and construction operations. Montreal is now looking at, much like Vancouver did years ago, they had a line they wanted to put on, but the conventional approach, would be delivered in 15 and would take 10 years to construct. They're now looking at a public-private partnership to accelerate it. And so what's happened is people have seen the benefits of getting things delivered and the risk transfer. I just have to mention Big Dig, and everybody thinks about cost overruns. It does happen. The private sector will lose money, but they'll also leverage international expertise to sort of make sure these things get delivered. But as they've been delivered, the public acceptance and the desire for more of these things to get delivered has been helpful. That then creates a pipeline in Canada, which then creates the expertise internally. So the governments on the various provinces of Canada have huge degrees of sophistication, expertise to manage these, to deliver the public policy objectives and interact with the private sector. But you end up with this sort of longer, it takes time, but this virtuous circle in terms of successful project delivery leads to more projects, leads to more private sector competition to deliver those projects, leads to good value for money and expertise. So Canada's just quietly been chugging away, building about 120 billion of these things. So it's been perceived as a public success. It doesn't mean there aren't problems, there aren't failures, but it's generally delivered what people wanted.
And I think, what Bruce is mentioning is a really important point in terms of the institutional structures that have been put in place in Canada, which we're still grappling with in the U.S. And I think Kent and Graeme can add color onto it too. But Bruce made a really important point in terms of sometimes these projects can go wrong. AECOM, we're involved in a number of P3 projects. We've certainly lost money, and I think to his point, in most of these cases, it's the private sector that is losing the money. Their skin is on the line. So it's not the public sector that's bearing the burden for all the cost overruns and scheduled delays. So to Kent and Graeme, the U.S. is not in the same position as Europe and Canada. We haven't done $120 billion worth of projects, but we've certainly seen an uptick in projects over the past 5 or 6 years. Governors, mayors, they're starting to realize the benefits of public-private partnerships. Where do you see hope in the U.S., and where do you see opportunities, and where have you seen public-private partnerships doing what has been done in Canada in terms of accelerating projects faster and addressing some of our most complicated infrastructure challenges?
I'll start. I want to pick up on something that Bruce mentioned as one of the benefits of P3, and that's acceleration of project delivery. We were involved in a transit project in Denver representing RTD. It's called Fast Tracks Eagle, and it's a commuter rail program, capital cost of just under $4 billion. The program was to be financed from grant money from the FTA. RTD was in the queue in the Pen-to-P program to get funds to start construction, but given the federal appropriation cycle, they were a year or two behind when there actually could be money dispersed and shovels could go into the ground and build the project. What the P3 technique enabled RTD to do is basically accelerate commencement of construction of that project. So essentially the private sector came in, invested equity, issued tax-exempt debt, started the project 18 months to 2 years ahead of when it otherwise would have been started if RTD would have just stayed in the queue for the Pen-to-P FTA funds. The result being the project came in under budget before the scheduled completion date and has really been heralded as a huge success and a great example of how private sector financing, management techniques, construction management can provide benefits to cities. And I think, Denver RTD, wouldn't have been anywhere near where it is now without this technique. The second example I'd like to give, and it's at the other end of the spectrum in the so-called brownfield market for P3s. We often think of P3s as building new assets, and certainly that's a big part of it. But there are municipal assets, infrastructure assets, which aren't necessarily core to what a city is supposed to be doing. For example, in the water and wastewater sector, it's a utility asset. And in this country and around the world, the energy sector has been privately owned and operated for years. It's regulated, it basically works. Water and sewer systems operate in much the same way. It's a user-pay system. It's a system that is in need of upgrades in terms of capital expenditure. We did 2 transactions for a private equity investor, one in Bayonne, New Jersey, where the water and sewer system was essentially concessioned to a consortium of KKR and United Suez. It was a 50-year concession where they basically took over the utility. They made an upfront payment, took on responsibility to put in smart meters, and in fact to take responsibility for capital expenditures for the 50-year term of the concession. The benefits to the city of Bayonne were, first of all, they were able to defease all of their municipal debt. They were able to upgrade their system, which hadn't been upgraded in decades with the investment that KKR and United Suez brought in. And they were able basically to take away the burden on both the taxpayers and the city budget for operating and maintaining the project over its whole life. So really it was a win-win for everybody. You know, Bayonne improved its finances, relieved itself from a funding obligation long term, and at the same time, Suez United came in to operate the system and to build it out and to bring private sector management techniques to the project. So I think both on the brownfield side, selling off existing assets that are non-core, and on the greenfield side, there's a very important role for the the private sector to play.
I'll just add to that to link this back together a little bit. If you think of public-private partnerships as the government just outsourcing activity, and private sector outsources all the time, you never outsource your core competency, though. And so what we're talking about here is governments outsourcing to the private sector things that the private sector should be able to do better. And that we proved right at the beginning when they bid for those projects, whether indeed they can do it better. You outsource, and as Bruce said, the more you're outsourcing, the more these projects are happening in Europe, in Canada, and here in the US, the bigger and better and more liquid that outsourcing market gets. That the more competition there will be for providing those services. So I think in a US context, it is behind some of the other jurisdictions we've heard about today, but you create that momentum, you create that snowball. As that market gets larger and larger, the benefits the public will get back in terms of better services, better facilities, will become more and more evident. The market providing that will become cheaper and cheaper, and the snowball will gather speed and roll ever faster. And I think we are at the beginning stages here in the US, but perhaps what we've seen in Canada or in Europe as an example is where it will go in the future.
I'd challenge the term outsourcing a bit in case we have members of the media here to say that it's not the traditional outsourcing that maybe folks could think about. I think maybe perhaps when you talk about it, it's an outsourcing that has performance guarantees tied to it. It's an outsourcing that has a direct link and connection to the public partner. There's a real accountability that's tied to it. It's not like you're just handing over an asset and walking away and just hoping and praying that things are going to go well. Is that correct? Am I
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thomas mentioned it earlier. The government reserves a right to terminate a contract at any point in time. It's the greatest thing about the P3 model, that you can grant it to the private sector, and at any time you can look at the performance being delivered and cancel that contract and cancel the services. It's a fantastic model in terms of managing the risk transfer and managing the performance of the project that you've given to the private sector.
One thing that I think everyone here is very interested to know about probably, and Bruce had mentioned it, is innovation and how public-private partnerships really catalyze innovation and for our cities and generating this smart city concept. In the projects you've seen for all of you, how has innovation been given life in a public-private partnership, whereas perhaps in more of a traditional form of delivery it's not? How has private finance and the involvement of private finance in projects really stimulated innovation? And if you have examples, it would be helpful to provide, or maybe in some of the projects you've already discussed.
Perhaps the simplest way of putting this across, if one thinks of traditional procurement by a public service body, it frequently works on the basis that the whole purpose is to procure a certain specification, whether of equipment, whether of standards, whatever. I think when we look at how the P3 model has evolved, where the innovation itself has come about is to specify the output, the service that is required, and actually to leave it to the tenderers to seek the best means of actually producing that particular output. Now that has, and there has to be a very conscious mental shift by the public sector, that has led to a very considerable increase in competition on innovation as to how services can be provided, rather than specifying simply that it is a specific service that is to be provided. Now that has been applied, I think, both in the water sector, the environmental sector. It has equally been applied in the innovation sector, for example, in the development of broadband networks in cities. So the whole notion is that the public sector should keep the competence that is essentially theirs, which is to say, we will assure the public that they receive essential services. But in fact, the definition of how those services are delivered can be left open to competition rather than dictated purely by a public service model.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that. I was just thinking, so not recently, a few years ago, McKinsey published a number to the view that if infrastructure was delivered more efficiently, that could generate roughly $1 trillion of benefit globally. So $1 trillion, especially in Canada, seems like a large number. And that tied to just efficiencies and what was discussed before about better project definition. What's the right project? In some cases, not delivering a project, just optimizing the existing infrastructure is actually a very good solution. Better design, construction, whole of life operations, and different solutions there. So that's just in sort of just better delivery. And I think what happens when the private sector gets involved is you're dealing with global companies. Like AECOM's a global company, and so they are pulling experiences and practices from around the world, where an individual municipality, going back to my tunneling example, that might be the one and only tunnel they will ever do or do for the next 10 years. That will be one of 10 currently being run by that private sector company globally, and one of 100 they'll have done over a period of time. So you just get that benefit. The other piece, which is just different, I find, with involving the private sector, is around commercialization. So my example before about the airports, the benefit of having a shopping mall at an airport or turning an airport into a shopping mall is you're providing a service people want, but that revenue generated by that then reduces the cost of providing the underlying service. One thing, and I was otherwise going to talk about it later, in our portfolio we're very proud of is we're indirectly the largest shareholder in Transit Wireless, which is working with the MTA here in New York to deliver Wi-Fi service on the platforms. Below ground, ultimately that might get extended to above ground and might get extended service generally. And that's a situation where, on top of a core service provided by the MTA, the private sector has been able to come in, provide a backbone of infrastructure that actually then leads to a whole series of potential opportunities for users of the MTA. It provides increased safety, security, but a lot of things that might not have otherwise been done, or if they were done, might have been done differently or later, whereas the private sector might sort of think through what the opportunities are for that service that might not otherwise have been done.
Anybody else on this? No.
I'd just say there's a phrase that necessity is the mother of all invention. I think competition is a pretty close second, and what the government achieves by P3s is tendering out, creating competition around delivering these ideas. So as Thomas and Bruce have said, government sets a goal, the private sector is in competition to deliver the best way or best means of achieving that goal, achieving the innovation you talked about.
And I'll just give one example on the Port of Miami Tunnel project. It's a massive P3 project that is relieving congestion downtown Miami and opening up one of the biggest ports in the U.S. And it would never have happened but for a public-private partnership, because the public sector and the private sector that would be delivering the project under traditional delivery would not take the risk of building the tunnel. The public-private partnership was able to harness expertise internationally, tunnel boring expertise, and the private sector risk appetite. And through the structure of the public-private partnership, they were able to take on the risk, whereas if it was just a traditional delivery, I don't think we would have ever seen this project move forward. So it's those kind of examples that are really unique, that can bring projects forward into reality. But one thing I would love to hear from the European perspective and Canadian perspective, and then also from Graeme and Ken, is we have to remind ourselves of the political realities, and to get mayors and governors on board in the U.S. and mayors globally that are leading cities on board. They have to be supportive of this approach. And to many, this is a new approach, and it carries with it some political risk. And in Europe and Canada, there have been they have similar labor issues that we confront here in the U.S., and they've managed to generate a significant amount of support for these projects. It's gone to the point where public-private partnerships is an accepted form of delivery. How has that happened? What sort of insights do you have that would be beneficial to other leaders, and in terms of thinking about how they could advance this new delivery approach without fear of political backlash?
I think there is a very simple approach for the vast majority of voters and taxpayers when it comes to looking at complex questions like this. Basically, if the method provides reasonable assurance of results over time, then it is a method worthy of confidence. If, on the other hand, it consistently fails to meet objectives and provide results, then obviously it is open to dispute and, in fact, rejection. I think the European experience has been based very much on results. It has, if you like, established a number of key principles, notably the notion that the public sector has both the political and moral responsibility for delivering the end result. They are the ones who decide what projects shall be done. They are the ones who decide the risk and the reward allocation. The private sector decides whether, in fact, the terms are sufficiently attractive, and the investment community decide whether this is a model that actually merits confidence in the long term. Now, I go back to my first comment. This is a learning experience. How we now look at public-private partnerships in Europe in 2017 versus how we did so, shall we say, 25 years ago, when the Channel Tunnel, for example, was one of the highlighted projects of the time, is actually radically different. And part of that difference is we have developed the competence of the public sector to a level equivalent to that of the professionalism of the private sector to actually do deals together. I think the other thing we have done is we have actually opened up to accountability and to transparency in a fairly significant way. Now, there are still parties to this discussion who would say transparency is not adequate, accountability is perhaps softer than it should be. But this is a learning experience. And we are, I think, getting results. We are achieving much greater results in terms of broader public policy objective than we were capable of doing 2 decades ago or more.
So we are running out of time, but I have a final question for the panel. And if you could dream big and think about a few ideal projects, one or several ideal projects that you see in terms of major infrastructure challenges out there in the world, in our global cities, and if in a perfect world we could advance them as a public-private partnership, which do you think they were? Could you provide any examples for this group of major challenges, whether it's here in New York City or elsewhere, where a public-private partnership could facilitate smart city growth?
Yeah, I'd like to focus briefly on the airport sector, especially terminals within the airport sector. If you compare the quality and the passenger experience in a U.S. airport, particularly in the Northeast, with the experience of the user in the Middle East or in Europe, it's a vastly different experience. They have more modern airports. It's just a nicer way to travel. The problem has been underinvestment in airport infrastructure in the U.S., and it's really a function of the fact that airports are public assets, and the money is only available to improve those public assets if you can make money from airlines, or you can tax people and use tax proceeds, or in the case of New York, subsidize the airport funding from bridges and tunnels, which is what the Port Authority does. There are a few examples, however, where the private sector has become involved in airport infrastructure that I think could serve as a model for other cities. For example, at LaGuardia Airport, right here in our backyard, the central terminal building is being developed as a P3, where a consortium of a construction company, a private equity firm, and an airport operator formed a company, took a lease from the Port Authority, and are responsible for a $4 billion redevelopment of the central terminal. Now that's being done with private funds, where the private sector is taking the risk of an on-time delivery, managing the airport in a very complex construction job, while at the same time allowing the airlines to operate their businesses. And the LaGuardia experience, I think, is a great example of how cities could draw on the private sector to improve and accelerate infrastructure delivery. And especially on the terminal side, it's not economically regulated, so it's extremely suitable for the private sector.
So any other remaining thoughts with the final time that we have in terms of big ideas?
Technology. I think Bruce mentioned Wi-Fi on the MTA. I think the private sector, great in smart cities, delivering technological solutions, be it renewable energy, telecommunications, some very exciting prospects.
If we take a very big global problem, cities account for 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Now, one of the longer term objectives we all share, whether it's through the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations or the Paris Climate Agreement, is actually to reduce the carbon footprint of our cities. It's essential to their long-term growth and success and inclusiveness. Now, what is already underway is the beginning of a long trek to actually bring the public and the private sector together, not only in the classical ways we have defined here, but by blending public and private capital, by risk sharing, by new regulatory frameworks. This is the type of objective, I think, that we have set important milestones for 2030, where we hope, in fact, to see a fairly significant movement, and in particularly measurable results in terms of global warming overall.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for joining us today, for being part of this conversation. Thanks to the panel. And if you have, I know we couldn't have time for questions, but if you do have questions, feel free to come find any of us afterwards. Thanks again.